Hello, and welcome back to The Good, the Bad, and the Uncanny, exploring the Older Testament. We are here today with Reverend Dr. Joe Scrivner. He is Dean of Chapel at Stillman College in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, and pastor of Brown Memorial Presbyterian Church. And both Matt and I actually have the honor of knowing Joe personally. Matt and Joe go back to their Princeton days, and Joe and I are in the same preaching group. So, Joe, we are delighted to have you with us. Thanks for being here today. We really appreciate it.
Oh, it's great to be here, and I'm delighted you all are doing this, and I'm glad to participate.
Wonderful.
Excellent.
We've asked Joe to be here with us to talk about the books of 1st and 2nd Kings. That's where we've gotten to at our point in the series. And so, Joe, I'm wondering if you can just sort of set us up a little bit historically here. What are we going to see happening in these books? Where do they begin and end, and what's the context that they're in?
Sure, I'll do my best. They're big books.
Yes.
But of course, they follow, I think Deuteronomy is an intro to Samuel and Kings. And so 1st and 2nd Kings takes us from the end of David's reign, coming out of 2nd Samuel. So David he passes away at the beginning of the book. Things transition over to King Solomon. So you have about a 400-year period, I think, from Solomon, maybe sometime in the early 900s to the fall of Jerusalem in the early 500s. And so you go through Solomon, kind of the climax with the temple being built, and Solomon's wisdom, the famous story of the baby and the two women claiming to be mothers. He builds the temple, but he also has problems himself. He has issues, we might say. And so ultimately, his sins lead to the division of the kingdom. And so the kingdom is divided between north and south, and you have Elijah and then Elisha. They're mostly in the northern kingdom. So I think Kings, and something I hope we can talk about more, is really trying to explain why events happen. What is it that the people do that bring about their blessing? What is it that they do? What mistakes do they make or sins they commit to bring about their downfall? And so the book, like a lot of the Older Testament, is trying to grapple with how do we make sure things go well? How do we make sure the Lord is blessing us? And what did we do wrong when things, don't go wrong, when we don't win this battle or when this kingdom takes over? And that leads into this fascinating larger issue with the whole Bible, the shift from expecting God to make all of God's promises come true in this life. And then there's the transition. Well, this life is not working out so well. Maybe things are going to work out in the next life. And I found that a lot of Christians have a hard time thinking that through in the Bible. I still find that to be the case, that Christians don't realize there's a shift in the Bible. So that's a larger issue. I think that's underlying the book itself, the books.
So within those books of 1st and 2nd Kings, how does the authorship kind of make sense of what's happening here, right? There's not just the history, which is bookended by the sort of the division that happens after Solomon and ends with destruction and exile. How is this book making theological sense of what's happening here?
Yeah, and there's a tension in the book between the writer judging the kings by how well they stick to worshiping in the temple and making sure they don't, quote unquote, syncretize too much with the neighboring practices, with worshiping of other gods. And then you have this odd story at the end of the book in 2 Kings 22 and 23, where Josiah is king of Judah, and the prophet Hilkiah finds the book of the law. So on the one hand, the writer is saying these kings didn't follow the law. They didn't uphold God as the only God. They worshiped with other nations. They brought in other things. And yet there's this thing at the end that says, well, we didn't know it was there. We didn't know all the laws. And so there's this tension. The writer is evaluating kings, north and south, by their obedience to what's in Deuteronomy. And yet we have this later story where Deuteronomy is apparently lost until it's found under Josiah, and then Josiah reinstitutes everything. But then you even have an odd aspect there, because it says Josiah did great, but Manasseh was so bad, God's still going to judge Judah. So I think they're still trying to figure out, they're still trying to explain, why is it that our kingdoms don't stand up to foreign powers? Why is it that the northern kingdom fell to Assyria? Why is it that we in the south fell to Babylonia? And so, and basically they put this at the feet of the kings. And so I mentioned to you all, Josiah might be like Paul Wellstone in Minnesota, a great hero who did everything right and was the person who brought the best days. And then you can fill in the blank in terms of a politician who makes everything go south or go haywire or cause us to go into deep decline. And I'll let you all in your audience fill in the blank with a state politician or a national politician who brings things to a crashing end. And so just like we talk about politicians and presidents and how they lead our nation well or they lead our nation poorly, you have a similar dynamic, I think, in the Book of Kings describing what's going on in the northern kingdom and then ultimately in the southern kingdom.
Is that what do we do with that theologically, right? Because sometimes it's, hey, the king feared God and did what God wanted, and so therefore God blesses, and if the king does poorly, God's going to punish. Is that a theology we should still hold on to? There are some people in America who think that's true, right? The nation's going badly because God's judging us, and therefore we need a righteous president or a righteous king. And what do we do with that? Or am I misconstruing what King says?
No, I think you're absolutely right. And the Christian church has been struggling with this for a long time.
As have the Jewish synagogues.
That's right. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I on the one hand, you appreciate that the prophets serve this role of calling the nation to justice. And the prophets, both in Kings and in their own books, do a good job and serve an important function of calling rulers to account. And I think that's a good model for us to keep in mind, and it has served us well in many ways. But also, I think it's really important for us to realize that the Bible, I believe, takes us to a point where when we keep going in the Older Testament and into the book of Daniel and then into apocalypticism and so forth, that however you want to describe it, I would say theologically, the scriptures take us to another point of focus, that you can't explain world events. You can't explain personal events. You can't explain national events simply by whether people are good or bad, whether they obey laws or don't obey the laws. That's going to end up in a whole lot of finger pointing, a lot of theology that's going to be very complicated and not very helpful at the end of the day. It's not helpful personally, and it's not helpful internationally or nationally. And I think this is what we see in the Bible, because at first, we lost to the Assyrians and the Babylonians because we were bad. But then after the Babylonians, there are the Persians, and then there are the Greeks, and then there are the Romans. And after a while, maybe it's not just us, Maybe this world is full of sin and it's broken and it's fallen. And maybe it's not simply about our obeying the commandments. And so I like to remind myself and other people that's where the story goes. And I think we struggle with this a great deal, both personally and in interpreting world events.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I'm reminded in hearing you, Joe, something that Brennan Breed said at our most recent Movable Feast gathering, which is that the Bible goes for comprehensiveness over coherence, right? It's willing to include multiple perspectives on the why do bad things happen question, among many other questions. And this is an example of this. We've got a pretty strongly expressed view in the book of Kings, but that's contradicted elsewhere. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
I mean, and so, in terms of scripture, I think you got to go to this other part of the Bible I really like, the wisdom literature, especially Ecclesiastes and Job, especially Job in particular, right? Where the friends are sort of walking around with Deuteronomy, 1st and 2nd Kings, you might say. They're interpreting Job's life according to this theology.
That's a good point. Yeah, that the friends who are so unhelpful in Job are it's not like their views are strange or foreign to the Bible.
Right. Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
They just don't work.
Arguments.
Or to our congregations.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So within the frame of First and Second Kings, right, which is, I think, this sort of goofus and gallant setup of who are the good and virtuous kings who get rewarded, who are the sort of bad and evil kings who get punished. Can you give us some sort of examples of what the book kind of praises and blames in terms of kingship and rulership?
Yeah, so I think one good place to go would be 1 Kings 11, where this is after Solomon has built the temple, and then the writer talks about Solomon's sins with various wives and various kinds of syncretistic worship. And so there you have a prophet appears to Jeroboam in the north and says, the prophet tears his clothes into 12 pieces and tells Jeroboam, you're going to have 10 of these, but God's going to keep 2. And so there you have both God judging the nation because of Solomon's sin. You have the prophet being the mouthpiece of God. And you also have this enactment, with the prophet and the clothes being torn into 12 pieces. And the prophet says, I'm going to give 10 of these tribes to you because of what Solomon did, but I'm going to keep my name with David and Jerusalem in the south. So at that point in Kings, it looks like God is promising to keep a kingdom in the south, but God's going to tear the kingdom, allow the kingdom to be split in the north. And you have this prediction of the downfall eventually. But then that gets into this issue of what we figure out later with the south under Manasseh and Josiah.
So then, I guess a bit of history. You've got a kingdom in the north, kingdom in the south. They used to be all of these distinctive tribes. They get pulled together during David and kind of falls apart at the end of Solomon. You've got kings in the north, kings in the south. Like, are these 2 nations then, Israel and Judah? Are they friendly toward each other? You've obviously got friends and family who are moving between. You've got 2 separate kings. They're all trying to worship the same God, right? Although there's only one temple in Jerusalem. Can you say a little bit more about how the politics and religion and society gets split, but also what holds it together?
Yeah, so you do have and just to be clear, the writer of Kings is writing from the perspective of the South. And so he's and I don't, just because I'm in Alabama, I'm not saying that should transfer to America, but he's writing as a Southerner. And so he mentions, for instance, that Solomon conscripted people from Judah to build the temple and so forth, that Solomon engaged in practices that he's portraying as problematic, as abusive. Nobody in the north no one was conscripted in the north like they were in the south. And so he's portraying this abuse of Solomon. This will go on to portray, he wants to present this as continuing in the north, where there's this constant stream of abuse. And so sometimes the north and the south cooperate, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they find it in their favor to work together to face off a kingdom. Sometimes Israel was generally, before it fell, the bigger kingdom. It had 10 of the 12 tribes. It had more power and so forth. And so sometimes it would try to subject the South or try to force the South to fight with it against another kingdom. So there were always these tensions between them. The South was smaller, didn't have as much power, didn't have as much land. And of course, the North falls first to the Assyrians in the late 700s. So there are tensions between them. The writer in the South always views the worship in the North as illegitimate. You have this complicated issue of Jeroboam setting up 2 bulls that may be a reference to Exodus, right? With the building of the idols there in the wilderness in Exodus. So you have this complicated intertwining of traditions that may include Exodus. The golden calf in Exodus may be pointing to what Jeroboam did in the north, and all of these things. So there's a lot of condemnation of northern religious practices from this writer in the South. But then he ends up admitting that his own kings fall prey to this too, except Josiah. But Manasseh, Josiah's predecessor, was so evil that Josiah's goodness couldn't undo God's judgment that Manasseh brought on the South.
And then as far as we know, the North, when they go into exile, they're gone forever. They're essentially washed out of history as far as we can tell, although there are some groups that claim, like the Samaritans in the first century, for example, claimed to be. So it becomes really a Judah story, and they're the ones who go into the Babylonian exile, and they're the ones who have to rebuild. So I'm just saying it's interesting that we don't really get a perspective from anybody in the North because they're wiped out, right?
That's right. I mean, we probably have some stories from the North incorporated into Samuel and Kings by this writer. He's probably using traditions that hypothetically we think they may have come down to the South after the Northern Kingdom was destroyed, assuming a lot of the good worshipers of the Lord of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they would find some solace down in the South around Jerusalem. So we think they brought some of their stories and some of their traditions, and those get incorporated. So we probably know about Elijah and Elisha because some Northerners brought those stories down, for instance. So we do have their stories. They're just presented by the Southerner. He gets to edit all of them together and present them in his larger framework.
And it matters who edits last, right? It matters who gets the kind of final take on the draft, huh? Tell us about. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Joe.
No. It does, and you have lots of famous stories, and there are so many of them. Of course, you got Elijah, and he just rides off into heaven. Elisha takes his mantle. You have Jezebel and the Northern King and Jezebel. Again, there's syncretism where Jezebel is presenting as having too much influence on the Northern King and the Northern Kingdom. And so the great stories of Elijah and Elisha are Northern stories. And they're good examples of prophets, and they're good examples for ministers. When Elijah, I believe, I have to get my J and S correct, but he's depressed about his ministry, right? After he preached about the fall of the prophets of Baal, he had a great revival or conference, you might say. And but then he ends up being dejected, sitting under the tree, thinking he's all by himself. And any professor or minister has been in that place from one time or another.
Yeah. Absolutely. So fill in the picture a little more of these prophetic figures of Elijah and Elisha. I think actually, when I think of Elisha feeling that same level of sort of dejection in ministry, I think of like right after the chariot comes and takes Elijah away. That's the moment that Elisha sends all those boys in to be attacked by bears. That's when he blows a fuse. So I've always seen that as his moment of sort of weakness in ministry there. But give us some, because this is kind of our first. Well, we saw Samuel as a prophet. We saw that there were some people in the books of Judges who were identified as prophets. We had Nathan coming in 2 Samuel. But fill us a little bit more on this picture of a prophet within the context of these narrative books. We're about to pivot towards Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and get the latter prophets. But fill in the prophets of the former prophets, right? Who are these figures? What's their role? What are their powers? What do we see them doing in these stories?
Yeah, and a famous example is Micaiah, the prophet Micaiah ben Imlah in 1 Kings chapter 22, where you have Jehoshaphat of Judah and the king of Israel, and they want to figure out if they should go into war or not. And Jehoshaphat says, let's ask the prophet. And the other king says, I don't like that guy. He never prophesies in my favor. He never tells me we're going to win. I can't stand him. He never gives me what I want to hear. And so they still decide to call Micaiah, and there are other prophets in the court who prophesy opposite Micaiah. And this is where you get this complicated story about a spirit of the Lord put the Lord put a lying spirit in the mouths of the other prophets. So you have this complicated court story of Micaiah is presented as the righteous prophet who's going to stand up against the kings and tell them whether they're going to win or lose, regardless of what happens to him. And he's going to be thrown into jail. He's going to be cast out. But he's brave, and he sticks with challenging power and tells them they're going to lose because they're unrighteous, because they're sinful. There are these other prophets who, have nicer houses, have a 2-car garage, they got a nice pension plan with the court, and they're like, oh, what does the king want to hear today? And so they tell the king what the king wants to hear. So you have this dynamic of prophets being in the court and being somewhat dependent on the court, or at least, they have access to the court. And so there's this issue of telling the truth to the kings. And that's a good story where you have one prophet presented as telling the story with integrity, and another set of prophets simply, like politicians or pundits, only wanting to tell the leader what they want to hear. And so that's an excellent story. And it also has this complicated aspect with the lying spirits, or the lying spirit in the mouth of the other prophets.
Which, it sounds so weird to us, but then you figure the Greeks did that, later on at the oracle at Delphi. They would send all these gifts and then say, tell us who's going to win the war. After saying the huge gift, right throughout the Middle Ages, in terms of the church and state's relationship, sometimes in this country, before sending troops into battle, it used to be, would Billy Graham spend the night at the White House? There are all these ways in which kind of political legitimacy depends upon prophets, and there's this question of how does power corrupt, right? Or how is it dangerous for a prophet to be too close to those levers of power, right?
Yeah, and so there's the issue of access. On the one hand, ideally you would want access as a religious person, as a prophet, as a minister, but then there are the complications with access. And are you willing to speak truth if it costs you access?
Yeah.
And a famous example in American history would be Martin Luther King in Vietnam with Lyndon Johnson. They had worked together so well on civil rights legislation. They had worked together well. They disagreed some, but they had the Civil Rights Act and all of this. And then King decides to speak out against Vietnam, and it's devastating for Johnson. And at that point, King was isolated by a lot of his friends too in the civil rights movement. They didn't believe he should say anything about Vietnam. So, and even now we have certain things going on around the world, and there's a lot of weight and care and concern, and sometimes demagoguery about what you should or should not say and what you can and cannot say.
Yeah,
that's a very difficult thing.
These are very live dynamics. We've been noticing that throughout this course. So if the legitimacy of these prophets doesn't come from access to the court, if in fact sort of having a tension or a separation from court is part of what demonstrates prophetic legitimacy. Where does that legitimacy come from? How does this relationship with God, authorize the prophets to speak here?
No, that's a good question. I think often they would show themselves to be true prophets by being accurate in the past, sometimes by working miracles. So with Elijah, you would have these miracles in some of these smaller stories, or even a big story like the prophets of Baal. And so they would have, presumably they're presented as establishing a reputation of being dependable and being someone in touch with God so that they can work a miracle or they can predict the future. So although the king may not want to consult them, they're still viewed as a prophet and believed to have a word from the Lord. Just like you and me, Margaret, we worked miracles before our ordination exams and all of those things.
That's exactly right. Not Matt, though. No.
Matt, are you ordained?
I am ordained. I'm ordained
minister.
Yes, I had the miracle requirement waived, however, so I didn't.
That's right. That's right. You don't have to work miracles to teach at Luther Seminary. No. You might need to. Yeah.
Well, depending on how you interpret the ordination exams and passing those are
right. Fair. That's fair.
I got myself in a position where I could write the ordination exams.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This talk about prophets makes me think, we've got this narrative of 1st and 2nd Kings, and then we've got the prophetic writings further down in the pages, and sometimes the books of Kings refer to the prophets, but the prophets often say, I was prophesying in this year of this king, and so we've got to do some flipping back and forth. But I always love that part in Amos, because Amos is from the south. He's from Judah, and he goes up to Israel. God calls him to go to Israel, to the north, and he's prophesying. And the court prophets are like, hey, we have an idea. Why don't you go back to the south and prophesy there all you want and leave us alone? Right. And Amos's response is like, what does he say? I'm just a dresser of sycamore trees. Like, I'm just an arborist, man. I don't want to be doing this anymore than you want me here. And so there's this kind of like, if there's nothing in it for me, you know, or if you're walking into the teeth of the lion, it seems to, at least for Amos, that seems to legitimate him. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, you mean in terms of being willing to, you know, speak truth to power and not
and there's just nothing in it for him other than being right.
That's right. Yeah. And even later, as you all know, Jeremiah is a famous example of this. He's thoroughly depressed, for lack of a better word, or downtrodden, and feels defeated because no one's paying him attention, no one's listening to him. He's not popular. His quote unquote church isn't growing, you might say. So I think that's absolutely true. And it's a good reminder of how difficult it is to try to give a word from the Lord when, as the Pauline writer says later, people have itching ears. That's at least that's the King James Version, I think, in 2 Timothy, right? Mm-hmm. It's true. And I guess itching ears have always been in Scripture from the beginning to the end.
Yeah.
So, Joe, we're just have a couple minutes left here, but I'm going to ask you to take us to a kind of depressing place, which is the end of 2 Kings, right? You're actually our last sort of voice here on this historical narrative section. Where do things end up as this book comes to a close?
Yeah, so you have, again, the story with Josiah. And Josiah, under Josiah, the book of Deuteronomy is presented as being found in the temple. And Josiah reinstitutes all of the laws of Deuteronomy, cleans out all of the false gods, clears out all of the worship of other gods that should not be taking place. So he's presented as this hero. But I think Kings, going back to this issue of why do things happen, I think Kings leaves us, in light of the whole Bible, with, or at least takes us down the path to the point where you can't explain what's going on in the world because of acts and consequences. That framework ultimately proves insufficient. And I think Kings is on the path to taking us to that point in the Bible as a whole, that you can't explain why things happen simply because you did A or you didn't do B or someone else did C. And so we see this with the writer. I think ideally the writer would want to say, Josiah restored us and God blessed us and protected us. But the writer presumably is writing after the Southern Kingdom fell, and so he can't say that. So he says, Josiah was great, but Manasseh was so bad that God had to punish us anyway. Well, he's trying to struggle with the fact, why did we lose to the Babylonians? If Josiah did everything right, dotted the I's, crossed the T's, why did we lose? And I think ultimately, and an interesting thing for you all, I'll check out your episodes later. I've been thinking about this lately, even with Daniel compared to the Maccabees, right? Where the Maccabees fight for their freedom and Daniel seems to be waiting on a miraculous resolution of sin and oppression.
Absolutely. Well, Joe, thank you so much for this conversation. Really, really appreciate it. I know it'll help our class to dig deeper into these books. And we gave you a challenging set with 1st and 2nd Kings, but you really helped us, I think, understand the shape of the history here, the theology here, and also just the characterization and the roles here. So thank you so much. Really, really appreciate your time.
I enjoyed being with you all. I'm inspired by what you all are doing, and at some point later, I'll copy it or just use your videos and send a donation for using your material. But I'm glad
you are welcome.
Glad to take part in it. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks, Joe.
Thank you.